Hello? Hello? Hey, there we go. I think this is working. There we go, great. Thank you very much. It was a lovely intro. Good morning, Amsterdam. It's a great honor to be here and kick off Hack in the Box 2016 with you. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the history of the crypto wars and try to get you excited about what's coming up next. As you heard in the intro, I was an early member of the operations team at Twitter and later worked on the information security team. As part of that team, one of the things that I do is I brought Twitter to 100% always-on SSL and worked with some of the initial law enforcement response when we were a very young company. And you know, I learned a lot while I was at Apple dealing with law enforcement. And you know, it's a very difficult world when you run a startup and you have to interact with law enforcement. You may have never done that before. And you know, all in all, I've been at this for quite some time. And you know, sort of before I tell you where we're going with the crypto wars, I want to go back and talk about where we've been. And I think right now, security versus privacy is one of the largest debates of our time. And in October of 1977, George Davida was an American computer scientist and cryptographer who received a gag order from the NSA. And he received this while working on a patent application for a stream cipher device. And the NSA really only knew about this because of a long-term voluntary cooperation between academic researchers and the NSA. And this was known as the Invention Secrecy Act of 1951. And the act gave them the power to block patents in the interest of national security. And you know, under this system, the academics and cryptographers would submit copies of technical papers to the agency before publication, and this gave the agency an opportunity to request the suppression of any sensitive material. And you know, at the time, not all mathematicians abided by this agreement, seeing it as a threat to the free exchange of ideas. And the free exchange of ideas is what our industry depends on to be successful and to meet the goals of cybersecurity and other requirements. And you know, this sort of pervasive problem was with us all the way through the 80s and the 90s. In fact, Bruce Schneier put out a book called Applied Cryptography. And at the time, you know, it was legal to publish because of the United States having the First Amendment and a right to speak freely. It was legal to publish a book on cryptography. But if you were to take the same exact source code and put it on a floppy disk in 1994, it was illegal. You were not allowed to actually ship that across lines because it was considered to be ammunition. In fact, last night someone told me a lovely story that if you had taken the source code of the book and you put the book in a rocket and fired it across the border, it was ammunition. And at that point, it would no longer be illegal to transmit anywhere because guess what? You would just fire it at another country, so it was fine. The problem is that the NSA tried to use export regulations and later deliberately manipulated cryptography to weaken it, to create multiple forms of cryptography, some for export and some for non-export. And you know, if you were using ciphers above 56-bit, you weren't allowed to do that because perhaps the NSA couldn't break those ciphers back then. This all sort of changes in the late 90s because Phil Zimmermann comes along and releases PGP. And this limited use of strong encryption, this begins to greatly concern the US government because it's not about easy access to strong encryption, it's about ubiquitous and simple access where the world is encrypted by default. And the US government tried to publicly ensure and retain its ability to decrypt traffic. So they fought us using technical methods such as key escrow, the insertion of vulnerabilities into the commercial encryption ecosystem, and by directly attacking systems, networks, and endpoint communications that targets would use. And you know, fearing the widespread adoption of encryption, we had this in 1993. We had the Clipper chip. And the Clipper chip was introduced by Clinton's administration, and it was a sort of hybrid hardware-software device which used key escrow, and it truly expressed the intent of the time, which was that the FBI or other companies would permanently have a mechanism where they could have your keys, and that encryption should come with a back door. And you know, George Davida from the 70s, who is terribly affected by the NSA gag order, was a strong, outspoken opponent against this. And this is not the right way to provide strong cryptographic tools to the public. So an immediate backlash from technical experts, privacy advocates, and industry leaders fought this device. And eventually, in 1994, the device was broken. At the same time, they took a different approach. They tried to sign into law a bill, which was eventually signed in with much opposition, called KEYNOTE. And KEYNOTE is the Communications Assistant for Law Enforcement Act. And that was signed into law by President Clinton. And KEYNOTE was sort of a direct reaction to the changing tide of the telecommunications industry. The telecommunications industry was then moving from old analog switches to digital switches, which are much harder to wiretap. It's not like I can walk up and grab a pair of alligator clips and clip onto a binding post and hear your conversation anymore. The telephone companies had to fundamentally redesign their systems. And if you go and look in like a Cisco manual today, you'll actually see references to KEYNOTE commands for intercepting communications. This was expanded multiple times. In 2004, it was expanded to include ISPs and voice over IP providers like Skype. And a few years later, the FBI began to push legislation to try to expand this to all online communications. And this died in very similar way, with much uproar and much fighting from the industry. And it did resurface in 2010. And we sort of marked 2010 as the beginning of the FBI's Going Dark campaign. And it came back again in 2013. And the problem with the proposal, as the Electronic Frontier Foundation stated, was that it would allow the FBI to fine non-compliant companies for not providing backdoors. And in 2014, we see this issue again with them asking for a national discussion about the use of encryption. So, in 1994, we thought we had won this debate already because cryptographer Matt Blaze had discovered holes in the Clipper chip, and the export controls were relaxed, and we started to see increased security on the internet, where suddenly, 128-bit, 256-bit encryption was available. And, for the most part, we thought this issue was just said and done. And the really interesting part is that it's like, did we actually win? Because I don't think we did. The impact of the weakening of our crypto systems, at least in the last year, has introduced 3 major SSL vulnerabilities: Freak, Logjam, and Drowned. And these vulnerabilities would not have existed if not for the fact that we had governments attempting to weaken SSL, over 20 years ago. And, for the third time in a year, we have another vulnerability. And, these restrictions were originally designed to give them an advantage, but the impact is a catastrophic failure of security for everyone. And more recently, we saw in the 2013 sort of Snowden revelations information about NSA Bull Run. And NSA Bull Run was interesting because we had won in the courts. The EFF and the US Congress and public opinion had said no to the Clipper chip and no to weakening encryption. But the NSA was working on it all along with projects like Bull Run, which created new vulnerabilities in NIST cryptography standards and the weakening of sort of the global cryptography market and attacking major libraries like RSA. And we still don't know the full extent of what this has done to us. And why continue on this? Why do I keep pressing this issue? And it's because if you look at someone like Amnesty International, they believe that in the digital age, access to and use of encryption is an enabler to the right to privacy. Encryption is an enabler of freedom of expression, information, and opinion, and it has an impact on the rights of individuals. And especially, it's a critical tool for human rights defenders, activists, and journalists, all whom rely on this with an increasing frequency to protect security and others from unlawful surveillance. And the real question is, what does that look like if we have ubiquitous encryption? What does it look like in the face of terrorism and crime? In my home state, in San Bernardino, California, a deplorable act of terrorism was executed by Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik. They killed 14 people on December 2nd, 2015. And this is not, this is an action from a few individuals, a few distraught individuals. And we cannot allow these sort of activities to dominate the privacy and security of the many. Terrorism is deplorable, it's awful, it's an attack on our general way of life, but we cannot allow that to remove our privacy. Farouk had an iPhone 5C, and the iPhone 5C, unlike the later versions of the Apple iPhone, had slightly weaker security. And the FBI had found one of his phones in the trash, and they asked Apple, through a standard court order, for his iCloud account and backups and any other data that Apple could provide. And Apple provided everything they could, but they did not provide access to the phone directly because the device is protected by a number of security mechanisms which were introduced. So There's a brute force protection on the device. If you try to type in a code too many times, the device will self-destruct. The operating system updates are signed, and in later models like the 6 and the 6S, they have a hardware enclave where your keys are stored. So they issue a court order in February of 2016 that demands that Apple build a custom build of the iOS operating system to remove the automatic erasure and pin limits that are on the phone. And if we kind of go back and look at the history of the crypto wars, this is very similar to what was occurring with things like the Clipper chip. It's like, you just build us something that we can get into. Interestingly enough, they tried to use a very old law from 1789 called the All Writs Act to compel Apple into unlocking the phone. And the Apple CEO at the time, Tim Cook, said this was an unprecedented use of the law. And in fact, we've seen the All Writs Act used many times to compel companies, and it's probably not what it was originally intended for. And the implications of this are quite chilling. So if the government can use a single act to make it easier to unlock your phone, they would have the power to reach into anyone's device to capture data. And later, Tim Cook responds and says this would set a dangerous precedent. And you could imagine what would happen if you had like a Samsung Smart TV or a Nest device, and suddenly along comes a court order to reprogram your device to turn it into a tool of surveillance in your home. It's really not acceptable. Apple could not provide this, would not provide it, and put up quite a fight from in the first part of this year, and they would not provide a backdoor into the phone. Interestingly enough, the FBI later claimed that they were able to access the phone using a currently unknown vulnerability. And there's a lot of speculation in March what company had actually provided that vulnerability, whether or not it was Cellebrite or other companies. But currently, we don't know what they used. It's very similar to what happened in November of 2015 with the Paris attacks, where where ISIL actually claimed that they had used Telegram. They used Telegram to announce the attack. And the idea here is that, should these activities be used as a pretext to monitor citizens and suppress dissidents? And, I think it comes back to kind of a central point, which is that it's not possible to make a messaging technology that's secure for everyone except for the criminals. It's just not possible. This is different than the view that James Comey, who's the current director of the FBI, has to say, because he believes that technology is a tool for dangerous people, which I don't agree with. And also that law has not kept pace with the technology, and it's created a significant public safety issue, which they sort of refer to consistently as going dark. And, if we look at someone like Oliver Day, who wrote Securing Change, he says, encryption doesn't really make targeted surveillance harder. We have cash, we have bearer bonds, fake mustaches, hats, hair, blankets, hair dyes. There's many ways to hide. And here's Snowden typing in his password with a blanket over his head, which is kind of funny. In 2015, I guess sort of frustrated by this problem, the Justice Department tries a new argument, and they say, what law enforcement really needed was to have US companies hold copies of encryption keys so that the government could get your information from them. And the problem is the companies are keeping stockpiles of encryption keys. It really increases the surface area of the attack. And if I'm able to breach a single company, I get the encryption keys from many people. And you could imagine anyone from hackers to foreign spies, and not the good hackers in this room, of course. But the same day, Director Comey said that the administration hadn't decided if they should seek legislation or not, which is completely insane because they had been seeking legislation since the early versions of CALIA to regulate encryption, and that we, the cybersecurity community, should invent mechanisms for the government to access encrypted information without weakening security, almost relegating the problem to something that we could solve while sitting in a garage. And I think at one point he actually said, I think Silicon Valley is full of folks who stood in their garage years ago that they would never be told your dreams are too hard to achieve. Well, unfortunately for the director, there's a difference between dreams and math. And math is what protects us. So his idea of going dark is not really what's happening. In fact, we currently live in sort of a golden age of surveillance. There's more information about you on the internet, and there's more information about you in social media than there ever has been. to see them make a statement that we're going dark in this world is not entirely true. You know, and the great irony of this is that their quest to access the data encrypted on one iPhone made it such that they opened the encryption debate to the world. And you know, this conversation, if it wasn't started years ago, it's going now. Now, the Berkman Center for Law, they released a lengthy paper on this if you'd like to read it. I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but in short, they cite the fact that end-to-end encryption is unlikely to be widely adopted. And I think that it's beholden to everyone in this room to make sure that that actually happens. You know, that software ecosystems that we work in are fragmented. So, you know, for many years it was very hard to encrypt information because you had to fight with varying libraries and all manner of problems. And now we want to move to a world that has encryption by default. And, you know, keep in mind that regardless of what changes at the endpoints, that they still have access to incredible amounts of unencrypted metadata from phone switches and other centralized communication points that they can readily use. And the other argument is that this has never been about one phone. Phones are not safes. They're not something that you just crack into and that's it, you've broken into one phone. We need technical solutions to break into devices, and that if we were to create code that could open one phone, it could open millions of locks, not one. And you know, repeatedly we heard from the FBI that they were not trying to set a precedent, they were not trying to set a message, and that they could create this magic targeted order that would only focus on one phone. And I think we all know that you write software once, it runs in a lot of places. You know, later we learned that there were 63 ongoing phone unlocking cases. In fact, 175 cases existed in New York. You know, and the request could come for additional phones as well. And you know, why haven't we seen any new legislation about this? And I think it's mainly because we already had this fight. We had this fight 20 years ago. You know, there's a great tweet that came up a while, and it was like, oh, please, give us all the keys. What could go wrong? And then later we find out that there's a group called APT6 that had spent years inside of US government networks conducting espionage. And this, you know, the FBI isn't alone in this problem. You know, BlackBerry in April of 2016, and I apologize because I know they're a sponsor here, but this happened. The reality is that there was a global encryption key that was used to encrypt many phones. And they actually made a statement saying that tech companies should not refuse reasonable, lawful access requests. But the reality of it is that there was still a global key. So again, we have a case of weakening encryption to provide law enforcement access, and this is not okay. Please, if you build crypto systems in the future, please don't do this. Please don't make one key for everyone. You know, much of the legislation that we talk about, it says, let's build in a weakness, let's build in a backdoor. And the idea is that there's a belief that backdoors will actually work. We frankly have to believe that there's a set of criminals that know how to hide themselves better than the best James Bond type person. And hiding yourself really isn't that easy. You know, there's a number of places where you can actually make mistakes and, you know, give away information about yourself. Everything from device backups, key backups. A lot of regulation right now is focusing around Touch ID and fingerprint scanners. So can you be compelled to give up your fingerprint to unlock a phone? And you know, Apple made a change recently in the operating system that if you don't unlock your phone in like 48 hours, you can't use Touch ID anymore. So you could imagine like your phone gets taken away from you, and then the day later when the court order shows up, they're not able to unlock your phone. So that's a good work on the part of Apple. You may send incriminating evidence by non-encrypted means. You might use cloud storage, and you might actually call someone and leave behind metadata. This is a lot to ask of your average criminal. Now, despite that, the encryption war continues. You know, some countries have already gone ahead and outlawed encryption, and the new crypto wars are pretty much global. There's at least 6 countries in Europe to go after end-to-end encryption in the style of the way WhatsApp works. Turkey has laws against it. Pakistan has laws against it. There's proposals in the UK, which we'll get to in a minute. And then the Netherlands, God bless, they love supporting it. They support encryption. So that's fantastic. And you know, the idea is that the encryption genie has sort of left the bottle a long, long time ago. We're not going to be able to put encryption back in the box, and we can't stop people from using encryption. And you know, with encryption is our best defense against mass surveillance. And as we have more mass surveillance, we experience less privacy. And what the FBI wants in the United States has been achieved in some other countries, much to the detriment of privacy and security worldwide. When we go and look at these countries, China, Malaysia, Russia are really, really bad. The levels of surveillance are extremely high. And we have other countries which are slightly better. But the thing is that still in the United States, we have the NSA proposing that ubiquitous encryption on the internet is a major threat to their ability to prosecute and to monitor you. So you have to remember that this is the way that they view the world. And I see these estimates and the work that they've done as, like the revelations from Snowden in 2013, they feel that it's put the sort of encryption world forward 7 years, that they think that we are in a position now globally with the use of encryption that we would not have gotten to without the sort of leak of this information. And I tell you, that's good, because we should encrypt all the things. It's more or less, to me, it's a manifesto. It's a to-do list for us as engineers to hurt the ability of those that would take away our privacy and our freedom. So, where is this all going? I think that there's going to be a rise in additional encryption products across the board. Apple's well on their way with secure enclaves. We're seeing more encryption being deployed. In fact, if we look at the Let's Encrypt project, which I'll talk about in a second, Let's Encrypt has been very successful. But the real thing is, we also will expect governments to introduce more legislation to come after strong encryption and promote impossible backdoors. And in fact, we already have that today. So in the UK, there's been proposals for what's called the Snoopers Charter. And this is designed to make the acquisition and disclosure of communications to the government easier. And it also pretty much makes hacking of endpoints legal for the government to do. And the Prime Minister, David Cameron, wanted to say in 2015 that they wanted to ban end-to-end encryption. And they wanted to eliminate any data that the government could not actually read. And, once again, it doesn't work this way. There's no such thing as good guy encryption, and there's no such thing as bad guy encryption. You cannot make it work because math. So, one of the other aspects of the Snoopers Charter was to maintain records of everyone's internet browsing activity, social media, email correspondence, voice calls, internet gaming, mobile phone messaging services, and store those records for 12 months at a cost to the country of $1.8 billion. If we have true end-to-end encryption and always-on TLS, this isn't possible, guys. It's not possible. Going back to the US for a moment, Burr-Feinstein introduces legislation in April of 2016, which is absolutely ridiculous. From a privacy standpoint, everything that we expected, the worst things we expected, we were not disappointed. They wanted to make all online data intelligible. In fact, in some cases, it would almost outlaw things like compression, like basic compression of data or password-protected zip files. The bill defines this as anything that could be decrypted, deciphered, decoded, demodulated, deobfuscated, and the reaches of this, they're very far. And as currently written, we believe that it would actually outlaw forward secrecy. And forward secrecy is essentially having a new key on each transaction, which no one can recover if the master keys are collected. But when I go back and I look at the Netherlands, once again, I see the Dutch government backing strong encryption and condemning backdoors. So bravo. This has serious chilling effects across major populations. Like, for example, in the United States, a staggering number of Americans, according to this Washington Post article, have stopped using the internet the way they used to. And this is because of things like the revelations from Edward Snowden, pervasive monitoring by governments, and continued breaches of personal data on the internet, once again because companies fail to encrypt and protect data at rest. And this limiting of ideas, the limiting of opinions that they may express online is not the world that we should strive for. So what can you do? Many of you in the room develop and work with technologies on a daily basis. I'm sure many of you run web servers. If you're in charge of HTTP-based servers and services, I highly recommend that you implement always-on HTTPS. There are other technologies that can enhance the security of your web servers, for example, HPKP and HSTS, and perfect forward secrecy. And there's a number of tools available to you, things like SSL labs. And you can also get yourself added to the preload list in Chrome, which will make sure that the browser by default always talks HTTPS. And if you think it's hard, it's not. if you use something like Let's Encrypt, Let's Encrypt is a service that simplifies the process of deploying and installing SSL certificates into web browsers. And Mozilla has graciously created a site that will tell you how to configure your software to have the strongest possible cipher suites. And this is available online for free. And, and it's been working. Because when we look at Let's Encrypt, in the last, I think this is less than a year. Less than a year, we've seen 3.7 million certificates issued and installed by Let's Encrypt. And that's a much greater view of security than we've seen in the past. And if you're not running a web server and you're a developer, encrypt data at rest, encrypt it in transit, even within your own network. And one thing I see a lot, I see a lot of grant proposals where people try to reinvent the secure messaging wheel. Please don't do that anymore. I don't think that many people are capable of writing strong end-to-end encryption, and there are open source libraries out there for implementing this, and we should work together on secure messaging, and we should not silo this knowledge. If you're an end user, and all of us are end users, know your vulnerabilities, know your threat model. You will have a very different world if you're a security researcher or a journalist working in a country that's fighting for democracy. It's very different. Promote end-to-end encryption in the places you work. Use strong passwords, use password managers. We've probably said these things 1,000 times in the security community, but we still need to keep pushing these issues. And other options for you with things like Tor and HTTPS everywhere that can protect you. And from a political standpoint, demand that your representatives and governments block anti-encryption bills. You can help the EFF, you can help the ACLU and other privacy-promoting organizations with your donations and your time. And while we can have this fight with technology, it doesn't really end until we solve the problem with proper legislation and precedent cases. And I feel that in this, we can work together to make the internet more secure. And I thank you for your time. It's been an honor to speak to you.